So what we're going to cover today, so we've got a different range of topics. So we've got infectious disease, immune system, modern medicine, and plant diseases. So immunity is a big topic we're going to go over today. That'll be the main bulk of it, and all the stuff that kind of links around immunity. So be prepared for all that. T cells, B cells, kind of humoral immunity versus cell-mediated immunity, all that kind of stuff. It is a bit of a complicated topic. A lot of people don't like it, others really do. But again, we'll go over it, make it nice and simple. You know, it just takes some time to get your head around it. So yeah, that's the plan for today. But again, very good topic for your exams that they like to ask about. Yeah, very relevant. So like I said, going over these topics. So we're going to start with pathogens, because that will set the scene nicely for the rest of what we need to know today. So pathogens, what do we want to know about pathogens? About ill health, different types of diseases, and viruses, bacteria, fungi, protists, all that kind of stuff, and pathogens in particular. I'm going to look at some good examples of pathogens. So yeah, today's session is also good. When I went through the PowerPoint, it was nice to see we've got a lot of good medical things as well. As a medic myself, we've got going over some different diseases, examples, and how they present and how they manage, which is a bit about kind of how the way we study medicine, which is quite nice. So you have a bit of an insight into that. As always, I always say, please print off the exam spec. It's always very useful, so you can see all this stuff is relevant in your exam spec. This is AQA. Print it off, have it in front of you, and you can tick it off as you learn it. That's the best way I found when revising. So yep, AQA, OCR have a big chunk on it as well, and Excel. Yep, so refer to your specific one, but it's relevant to all the exam boards. So pathogens, how confident do you guys feel about pathogens? So like we discussed, pop on Slido, there's the code and the QR. So get started with that and give me a quick rating. 5 being very confident, know all about pathogens, very happy. 1 being I don't know anything, and then in the middle, just to gauge how much you guys know. So we're looking at things like different types of pathogens, so viruses, bacteria, fungi, the differences between them, and then kind of some examples of infections, of a viral infection, a bacterial infection, a fungi infection. Good. We do have 1 person here, at least. That's good. Yep, I'll just give you a couple of minutes to do that. So just get started on Slido and just stay logged into that, because we'll be using that as always. Yep, I'm just explaining it for those of you who might be new, because we always get new people, but I'm sure majority of you know how this works now. You're used to me. You're good. Most of you seemingly happy with it so far. Let's give it a last minute or so. So on the whole, I'm quite happy, seeing some good ratings, mostly 3s, 4s, and 5, which is good to see. Well, I've not got any more ratings coming in, many, so I'll just move on. So on the whole, it's quite happy. I'm seeing 3s, 4s, 5, which is good. Hopefully we can cement that knowledge. This bit isn't too tricky. I think we get more complicated when we go into immunity. But this sets up the session nicely because it's very relevant to the rest of what we're going to cover. Cool. So health versus disease. So important to know your key definitions, as always. In your exams, they like to ask about definitions. So when we talk about health, health involves mental, physical, and social well-being. Just like when we talk about our day-to-day health, we, it's not always just about being physically fit. As of course, physical health is very important in staying in shape, staying fit, keeping your weight controlled, etc. That's all good, but also health includes mental health as well, and that's a big topic nowadays. I'm sure you guys are aware of mental health, and keeping our mind nice and fit and healthy, being happy, and social well-being as well. So health includes all those different aspects, and disease is the way we define that is when we say we're being unhealthy due to malfunction of the body or mind. Sorry, I'm really bad with this pen. I'm sure you guys are aware. So that's what we classify as disease. So kind of unhealthy due to malfunction of the body or mind. So disease can obviously include, again, like it mentions here, malfunction of the body. So like if you're physically unwell, say you have the flu or something like that, and you're really groggy and tired and you're vomiting and you've got a fever, obviously that's a malfunction of the body. But then it can also be of the mind. So again, sometimes what you don't see. So people have mental health diseases, people have depression, for example, or have psychosis like schizophrenia. That is a disease of the mind, and it might not be visible, but it's there, and it's a diagnosable disease. So think of health and disease going hand in hand, health involving mental, physical, and social, and then disease being a malfunction of that health, basically. Yeah. So having a disease is not the only way to unhealthy. Poor diet, unfitness, and loneliness make you unhealthy, but not diseases. So yeah, obviously disease is an important part of, being unhealthy, but at the same time, you can maybe not have a disease, you can just have a poor diet. So for example, people who are unhealthy, you might say maybe overweight, and that can be due to poor diet or not doing enough exercise, but that isn't necessarily due to a disease. But then obviously some diseases you might have, so like, people with heart disease, for example, tend to be more overweight. So that's due to a disease, which can cause that. And some diseases are more prone to putting on weight. So yeah, also just differentiating the fact that you don't have to have a disease to be unhealthy as well. It can be due to lifestyle things and other stuff. But just remember health and disease going hand in hand. Obviously, disease being effective of your health. So just remember the definition: health, mental, physical, social well-being, and disease is unhealthy due to malfunction of the body or mind. And this is quite basic. So diseases, so we're going to talk about diseases in a bit more detail. So there's a wide different range of diseases, but the way we like to categorize it is what we call infectious disease and non-infectious disease. So again, I'm sure most of you will be able to understand that already before I even go into it. But infectious is communicable diseases. So for example, COVID-19 is an example of an infectious disease because we can spread it on and pass it on to each other. That's why we had the whole lockdown and like not self-isolating when you have COVID and stuff, because it's easy to communicate to others. And then you have non-infectious diseases. So yeah, for example, if I had depression, I don't know why I'm using that, it just came into my head. It's not a disease which you can pass on. Obviously, if someone hangs around with you, their mood might be affected, but it's not something which can be transmitted from one person to another, like COVID is. Like if I breathe, and because COVID is done by droplets, so when I breathe near someone, and if I had COVID, it's likely they could breathe in those droplets and get the virus, or through touching of surfaces and all that. Obviously, I'm sure you guys are aware. Just thinking about communicable and non-communicable disease, infectious versus non-infectious. So let's go into infectious first. So infectious, we talked about being a communicable disease that can be passed on, and that's caused by other living organisms called pathogens. So pathogen, again, you're going to see this word a lot over the next few hours. And also you'll see this a lot during your whole biology course. So all a pathogen is an organism that can cause disease. It's not a specific type. It can be any bacteria, fungi, virus, etc. But just think of a pathogen of an organism that has the potential to cause disease. So any organism that's that's foreign and that's going to cause disease is a pathogen. So a pathogen is not a good thing. When you think of a pathogen, it's not something nice. It's something that's going to cause you to have a disease. So some examples of infectious diseases. So bacteria. So cholera. So cholera was a really, really bad kind of waterborne disease. We don't see it very much often, but it was passed on in drinking water. But since in the recent 21st, 20th century, we started to clean water with chlorine. So we have small amounts of chlorine in our drinking water, and that helps to kill the cholera, but it's not very harmful to us, small amounts, so that's fine. So that's a communicable disease because that used to spread through water and it was easy to be passed on to other people. Fungi is another example. So certain types of fungi, so the athlete's foot. So it's a certain type of fungi that grows on your foot, Tinea pedis, I think the name is of the actual fungi, and that's communicable as well, because if you share towels or if you share materials where that fungi can be passed on, that could then spread to someone else's foot, or swimming pools and all that. So it's important to be aware of that. Often you have people, if you have good foot hygiene and you clean your feet regularly and that, you probably won't get it, but it can be passed on through that. COVID-19, so I mentioned obviously COVID is a virus that can be communicable through many ways, like I said. Many protista, like malaria, is an example of a communicable disease. Obviously, it's get passed on through mosquitoes, and then like also parasites through tapeworm and stuff. So it's not just through people to people, it can be passed on through other ways. But any disease that can be passed on from one person to another via some means is an infectious disease because it has the ability to spread. Infectious disease can be spread by some means. So just think about that. And the best way to think is always just think of some examples. That's what I would do. So yeah, think of, these are your 5 different types of disease we're going to look at. Just think of some examples of how they can spread. And then as opposed to non-infectious diseases, they're not spread by, by other people or through other means or insects or whatever, but they're more caused by genetic makeup, lifestyle, environmental. So it's down to on the person, and depends on what they're doing, if they get it or not. So genetic disease like cystic fibrosis, so that's just through genes. It's not through infectious where people spread it or it's spread via some sort of means. It's just part of genetic makeup. So if someone in my parents don't carry cystic fibrosis, they don't have to have the disease to give it to me. They can also be carriers. I'm sure you guys have studied that. But if there is no gene for cystic fibrosis, then I'm not going to get the disease. That's just simple. Unless there's a mutation of some sort, but it's very, very rare. But it's going to be passed on through genes, and that's due to my genetic makeup. So that will determine whether I get cystic fibrosis. So currently, I'm not aware that I have cystic fibrosis, and I don't think I do. So I'm not likely to get it because that's just not in my genetic makeup. Others are involved in lifestyle, so things like lung cancer. Lung cancer obviously is the most common risk factor for lung cancer is smoking, and that's caused by obviously an environmental choice. So people who choose to smoke carry that risk, but you don't spread lung cancer. Like if I get lung cancer, I'm not going to spread it to other people. It doesn't mean that people who don't smoke don't get it, but I'm just saying, like, it's not communicable from me to someone else. Someone else would also have to get it by their own means. Say they also smoked or they had other risk factors for it, then they might get the disease. And then mental health disease is another one which I mentioned. So mental health diseases, again, they can be increased by having family history. So I think if your parents had a mental health disease, you're more likely to have one. But at the same time, doesn't mean you're going to get it. It doesn't mean it's communicated from one person to another. So if I have depression, it doesn't mean I can spread depression to everywhere by a communicable source. So that's the difference between infectious, non-infectious. And like I said, just think of examples. So like we've given you a good few examples here, which will kind of hopefully make a bit more sense. So diseases. So we talked about diseases. We discussed disease obviously being unhealthy due to malfunction of the body or mind. So having one disease can make a person more susceptible to other diseases. So that's often common. So again, I work in medicine, obviously, and I'm studying that at the moment. And so you see patients come in, generally not with one disease, but with a whole range of different diseases, especially in the elderly. Obviously, when you get to an old age, you tend to be prone to lots of different diseases. So yeah, just be aware that often sometimes having one disease can make you more likely to get another disease. Like when you see overweight people, they often might have heart disease and diabetes, for example, just as a quick example from my head. So it can often people can often present with a range of different diseases. A good example is HIV. So again, I don't know if we've gone over HIV, but it's definitely in your spec. But HIV it stands for human immunodeficiency virus, and what that means is that there's kind of HIV. It kind of tampers with your immune system, and it lowers your immune system function in your body. So it prevents the immune system working properly as it normally would, as it says here. And so that is going to, obviously, if your immune system's not working at its best, you're more prone to getting other diseases. So HIV will make it more prone to be getting infections and other sorts of diseases, and that's why it's really important you tackle HIV. And when it gets to that stage where your immune system is really low, in terms of its white blood cells and other immune function, then that's what we call AIDS, which I'm sure you guys are aware of, because AIDS is always in the news, and there's big global appeals for it, as it's a very important thing. Some treatments also increase the risk of other diseases. So radiotherapy is a brilliant example. So radiotherapy is where we use like radiation as a form of cancer treatment, because it's very, very strong and effective in killing cancer cells. Cancer cells require quite invasive treatment. So radiotherapy, even though it treats cancer, it can also cause more cancer, because it can affect other cells and cause them to mutate and divide at a rapid rate, and that can lead to more cancer, maybe a different form. Immune reactions to pathogens can cause allergies. So those of you who have allergies, so a common, for example, people who have like nut allergies or things like that, that's because your body has an immune reaction to when you're exposed to that, and it sees it as a foreign body. Viruses can also cause cancer. So a good example is human papilloma virus. That's a common virus we see. It's the most common example of that is that it can cause cervical cancer. So that's why I think all the girls have vaccines at young ages for human papilloma virus, because they make sure they have their jabs, because if you have that can increase your chances of getting cervical cancer later on in your life. So yeah, diseases, they're very complex. That's, I think, the kind of point we're trying to make here. But just be aware that diseases can be passed on, communicable, and they infectious, and then also non-infectious ones, which you can get from genes or from the environment, etc. And then just being aware that one disease can make you a bit more susceptible to others. Not in all cases, but in some cases it can. So like HIV is a good example of that. And so yeah, just be aware that diseases are all interlinked as well, and diseases can cause other diseases. Cool, we'll just do another quick Slido question to get your brains working. So we went over infectious and non-infectious diseases. So which of these is an example of an infectious disease? I'll just wait for a couple minutes just so you guys can answer that. It's a very straightforward question, shouldn't have any issues, but just make sure you're awake on this lovely Saturday morning. give it a last minute or so. We'll move on for time. So good, majority of you got that right. So the answer is flu. So flu, remember, you get flu it's common in the winter months, and it is spread commonly from people to people. So, when the flu is going around, and all the kids are getting out of school and all that, and yeah, the flu is a virus, and it's commonly spread through droplets, through breathing, and from person to person. Depression we went through, and is obviously we know depression isn't an infectious communicable disease. Huntington's is similar to cystic fibrosis. It's a genetic disease, and then lung cancer we went through as an environmental kind of risk factor disease. Obviously, some genes might play a part as well, but it's not something you can spread from person to person. Good job. So transmission of pathogens. So different pathogens obviously have different methods of transmission, and that's what we're going to talk about. So obviously went through the fact that disease can be communicable, non-communicable. It's infectious versus non-infectious. So there's two main categories of the way we can transmit a pathogen. So direct, which is where we say physical contact between an infected person and an uninfected person. Or indirect, so no direct human-to-human contact. So we discussed some ways about how stuff might be passed on without having human-to-human through other means, and that's what that includes. So person to person, you'd say it's direct transmission, but indirect would include kind of a third party in the middle, so not directly human to human. So for example, malaria is passed on through mosquitoes. It's not I pass it on to someone else, or it's not human to human, it's like a third party in between it. So yeah, direct versus indirect, quite self-explanatory. So different ways we can transmit. So I discussed some of these before, but you need to be a bit more aware of how it's passed on. So droplets is one way, so droplet transmission. So pathogen is spread through large droplets. So for example, coughing, sneezing, talking, spitting, laughing. So it was believed COVID, I think, was a droplet transmission, because when you talk, you release kind of droplets that you probably don't see, but they're released into the air, and then they could be transmitted and inhaled by someone else, and you're inhaling those droplets. So just talking, for example, is a common way in which you can spread the COVID, because I know people, obviously, when you're coughing or sneezing, you tend to be like, oh, someone's coughing, sneezing, but just remember things like talking also release droplets, because you're releasing water vapor when you're talking. The droplets coming out your mouth. The droplets is where you spread it through large droplets with these kind of means. So again, quite self-explanatory. So kind of coming out your mouth, coughing, sneezing, talking, spitting, laughing, all that kind of stuff. And that's why it was very useful to wear masks during COVID, because masks kind of mask your face, and they block some of that droplet transmission. Not all of it, but some of it. So often if two people are wearing masks, less droplets are going to be exchanged, so it's a bit more safer. Airborne, so it can be spread kind of via small particles in the air, like dust. So spores are an example of that. So yeah, that's another common way that we see. Vectors. So vectors is what I was discussing before, kind of about the indirect transmission. So pathogen being spread through another organism. So normally an animal. It tends to be insects as well. So mosquitoes are a brilliant example of that. So all you guys are aware of mosquitoes, which, when you go to a nice hot country, you get mosquito bites, and they're a pain and a nuisance really. But yeah, so mosquitoes can transmit obviously disease. So particularly stuff like malaria is spread through mosquitoes. Also ticks and fleas, so other kind of insects, and then rats as well. So the Great Plague, which went on in history, rats were a brilliant carrier of that. Not as in they were good carriers of it, not that it was good or anything, but Yeah, so rats are also an example of that. So vectors, when I mention vector, just think of, another organism. So that's what that means. So droplets, airborne, and vectors. And then direct contact. So they were all kind of, well, a couple of them were ways of direct contact, but then direct contact was when it spreads through kind of contact with an infected person, so like hands or rash. If I shake someone's hand, you can get a disease or a rash. So a good example of that is chickenpox. So I'm sure you guys are aware of chickenpox. Everyone's had it. That's a specific type of virus that you see. It's common in younger kids, and usually kids get it and then they'll be immune to it after that. We'll go through immunity later, but again, that's generally through direct contact. So kids come home from school or nursery and they might be in contact with someone with chickenpox, and they're maybe likely to get it then. And in the US, they do those chickenpox parties where they just kind of let all their kids get chickenpox for the sake of it, because often every person will get chickenpox at one point in their life. It's often easier to have it when you're a child. It's less severe, and I don't remember when I had chickenpox. But yeah, chickenpox can be spread to a rash generally. You tend to see a rash with different spots and stuff. So yeah, that's another way it can be transmitted. I think some more serious things like meningitis, I'm sure you've heard of, which is quite a serious infection, and that often presents with a rash as well. And so yeah, they are transmissible. That's why it's important to identify them and not be in contact with other people. And then vehicle transition as well. So pathogen can be spread through like an infected object, so through clothes, tools, food, water, that kind of stuff. So common example of that. So food's a brilliant example. So obviously when food goes off, so if you leave food too long and you eat it, say several days after, then that can have a pathogen and you can be spread through infection. Or things like uncooked meat and stuff like that. So uncooked meat, like uncooked chicken, Salmonella is a common thing which you can get from that. So not overly common, but it's something that can happen, and that's why it's important to make sure your meat's cooked. So yeah, and water, obviously if your water's not clean, you can spread diseases through that. But then things like clothes, tools, all that. So I was mentioning about fungi and athlete's foot earlier. So kind of you've got to be careful with clothes and things like that because it can be spread through that. And yeah, so that's it. So we went through the droplets, airborne transmission, vectors, direct contact, the hands, rashes, and then common like vehicles. So vehicles being kind of an infected object of some sort. So yeah, again, this is all fairly basic, hopefully quite self-explanatory, hopefully you're not having any issues. So conditions that affect transition rates, so having a high population density. So obviously if there's a lot of people living in a certain area, having a dense population, that can affect transition rates, especially for things that are like kind of airborne or droplet transmission. So for example, COVID. So if you've got a lot of people living in a high area and you're coming into contact with more people, you're more likely to spread it. Things like having dirty conditions. So if you're not having clean water, clean food, all that kind of stuff, that can obviously affect the rate of transmission. Living in humid conditions as well, that can also have an effect. And then having high vector population. So kind of if you live in a country which has a lot of mosquitoes, you're probably more likely to get malaria than if you live in the UK where there's not many mosquitoes. So again, all basic stuff. So that's kind of diseases and transmission of pathogens. So we've discussed about how they can be transmitted, so different ways, and how that transition rate can also be affected. So we're going to go into detail about bacteria, viruses, fungi, and look at that in a bit more depth and how they can pass on. Starting with bacteria. So bacteria is a very common infection we see. Again, you guys should have studied bacteria by now, I reckon. So this is what a bacteria cell looks like. I'll just go through it quickly anyway. So this is a bacterial cell. So bacteria have a cell wall and then they have a plasma membrane, which is your cell membrane. They have ribosomes. They have these kind of things on the end called pilus, a cytoplasm, and their DNA isn't stored in a nucleus as such, but they have little kind of pockets of DNA called plasmids. So these are plasmids, which are like little kind of pockets which kind of store DNA. They do have this is like a big area of DNA they're called a nucleoid, and they have a flagellum, which is a tail which helps them to swim. And and get to places more easily. Not necessarily swim, but just helps them to be more mobile and move around. So how do bacterial infections spread? So they reproduce very rapidly. Often they release toxins which damage tissues, and roughly they're about 0.5 to 5 micrometers in size. So very, very small and not visible. But yeah, bacteria, that's their kind of mechanism. They're very good because they can reproduce rapidly and release certain toxins which can have effects on tissues. So when you get an infection, you'll feel the effect of that, and you'll need something to manage that, like antibiotics, which will, again, prevent the bacteria from reproducing, or they'll kill it. So we're going to go over that later as well. So a good example of a bacteria is TB, so tuberculosis. Often we don't see it in the UK very much, but it is common to be seen in third world countries, and it's quite a nasty infection for those who get it. And often we do screening and stuff for TB, but I think when people come abroad, because it can be easily passed on. So it's caused by 2 types of bacteria. So these are specific types of bacteria, and it's a droplet transmission. So we went through it before. So it can be passed on through talking, speaking, laughing, coughing, all that kind of stuff. And generally, this is the way it presents. So you get a kind of a cough, you get weight loss. So you'll be losing weight without even realizing it and thinking, why am I losing weight when I'm not even trying to? Night sweats, which are never a good sign. Fever. So fever is a very common sign in all bacterial infections, having a fever, and then kind of feeling very fatigued, tired, swelling on your neck, loss of appetite. So kind of very generalized kind of disease symptoms that you often see. Yeah, and that's the way TB presents. So TB is a good example of a droplet bacterial infection. So good to know some examples when you think. Another good example is Salmonella. So like I mentioned before, Salmonella is often passed on in food. It's a common one in chicken. So uncooked chicken, you can pass on Salmonella, because things like beef and steak, I think red meat, often people have their steaks kind of rare, but they have some blood and stuff inside and it's not fully cooked. But stuff like chicken, it's important to make sure it's fully cooked, because you have a risk of Salmonella, and that can be often horrible. You get diarrhea, vomiting, kind of tummy pain, a bit of a nasty infection to have. So yeah, that's another example of a bacterial infection, but this time passed on by a vehicle, so food. So I've given you 2 good infections there, but kind of passed on by different means. That's bacteria. So again, not overly complicated. Just be aware of how bacterial infections are spread. So we went through about the reproduce rapidly, toxins which damage the tissues, and then basic awareness of the kind of the cell structure of a bacteria. Viral, so virus infections. So COVID is a brilliant example of that. I think it comes up in the slide. So viruses are very different because they use host cells to replicate. The viruses aren't able, they don't have their own machinery, and they're not physically able themselves to actually replicate. So what they do is they attack cells. So once viruses kind of get inside you, they take over your body cells and they hijack the replication machinery, and their DNA will take over that cell, and it'll take over the machinery that helps the cell to kind of replicate and divide. And so what they'll then do is they'll then use that cell to make lots of copies of itself. So we call that host cell. So viruses will hijack and take over a host cell, and then they'll kind of use that to replicate. And yeah, so we have different types. So we're going to have active or latent. So often active viruses we see. So active virus is the one where you have kind of physical disease. So that's when it's causing the host cells to replicate and causing those host cells to die out and become viral cells. But often you can get latent viruses, because sometimes latent just means they're sitting there in the host cell, not causing any problems, but they're sitting there lying dormant, and they might be activated at some point. They're even smaller than bacteria. But yeah, and this is what they look like. So they have these kind of glycoproteins, antigens on the side, and that's what they use to kind of bind to different body cells. So HIV is a good example of a virus, and they have like different attachment proteins on the end which bind to the white blood cells in your body, and that's why it lowers your white blood cell count, because they use white blood cells to replicate, but in the process of doing that they destroy those white blood cells. I mean, they can't carry out their function. They have a genome in the middle which has the genetic material. Sorry, a capsid. Capsid contains genome and all this other stuff, different enzymes that help it, and then they have these proteases. So just be aware, general structure of a virus. But important to know that viruses use host cells to replicate, because they don't have the physical ability to replicate themselves. They have to take over cells and use their ability to do that. So like I went through before, HIV is a brilliant example of that. So HIV/AIDS, so human immunodeficiency virus, and then AIDS, I believe, is acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, I think. Let's check that though. I think it means that. Always bad with my acronyms. So HIV is transmitted through bodily fluids. So often HIV transmitted through things like unprotected sex, and kind of sharing needles, anything like that. So if you share bloods, if you have a blood transfusion from someone with HIV, you're probably more likely to get it, or unprotected sex, and it can also be transmitted vertically through like mother to baby. But what they do is they use white blood cells as hosts. So like I mentioned, they use white blood cells as their host cells. So once they get into your body, they will take over your white blood cells, take over the machinery of that, use that to make lots and lots of copies of itself. And then in the process of doing that, obviously spreading, but they're also diminishing your white blood cells. And so white blood cells are very important in fighting infection and disease. You know, you get a lot of disease and infection which you're not even aware of because you might not have symptoms, but your body fights it off naturally. But when you have HIV and AIDS, they become a lot more of a problem than they would in a normal unaffected person. And then once your white blood cells get to a really, really low stage where it's really low and your immune system is really not good, then that's what we call AIDS. Because usually we have many ways of tackling HIV in the early stages to make sure it doesn't develop to AIDS. And people with HIV die of other diseases due to damaged immune system, like I mentioned. Again, that's quite self-explanatory, but that's what virus looks like. And then flu is another example. So I mentioned this before as a good example of an infectious disease. So influenza is the full name. You can see flu is inside that. So that's transmitted by droplets. So viruses kind of evolve very quickly. They change their glycoproteins and antigens. And that's why flu kind of varies over the year. And it varies each year. So some years flu can be really, really bad because viruses kind of adapt and change. And this is the problem, because once your body knows how to tackle it, obviously viruses will constantly change and try and change the antigens and their proteins to try and work around your body's kind of mechanisms to fight it. So that's why often with flu you can get infected again and again and again, because just like different strains, a bit like COVID, how with COVID it's common to get, a lot of people have had COVID maybe 2 times, 3 times, some people have had it 0 times, but it's because of the way COVID mutates and causes different variants. Same with flu, exact same principle. There's different variants of flu, and that's why it can affect you, even though people have flu vaccines and all that. But most people, I think, have flu. It's quite mild. It's just they're often unwell for a week, and then they're absolutely fine after that. It's quite self-limiting. Ebola. So Ebola was quite a nasty virus. So not really hearing about it much now. I think they managed to tackle the majority of it, but it was a common disease in West Africa. I think it started and spread around Africa. Yeah, quite a nasty one. There was a lot of memes made about it. I'm sure you guys are aware of Ebola, but it's a horrible, horrible disease. Again, transmitted by bodily fluids, similar to HIV, and you get kind of fever, body aches, really bad bleeding inside. So I think rectal bleeding through your bum. There was really, really bad symptoms, really not nice, diarrhea, vomiting, stomach pains. But I think it's under control now. I think they managed to find a vaccine and it's all under control. It didn't really spread out of Africa much or anything. So yeah, that's another example of a viral infection. Cool, so that's viral infection. So just important to remember, think of HIV, that's a brilliant example of it. But the way viruses involve host cells to kind of take over their machinery and use that to replicate, and that's the way viruses can become a problem. And then the way they do that is they have these attachment proteins on the end, and then they have all the genetic material in the middle in what we call a capsid. So yeah, my name's Sid, there's a capsid. So I don't know, I used to remember that. Cool. So we've been over bacteria, we've been over viruses. So protista. So these are organisms that are a mix of bacteria, plants, and animals. And what they do is they feed on cells. So they'll get into cells and they'll feed on them. And it's kind of a bit more of a specialized kind of way. So yeah. So a good example of that is malaria. So malaria obviously is caused by that certain pathogen, but it's transmitted by mosquitoes. So the way it happens is mosquito will bite an infected person, and then these what we call Plasmodium gametes, which is what the pathogen is, will enter the mosquito, and they'll develop into zygotes. Zygotes will travel into the salivary gland. Sorry, that should be, yeah. So it bites an infected person, and then yeah, it's just a way of passing it on. So mosquitoes will get the infection from an infected person. Basically, the infection will enter the mosquito and fuse into their kind of makeup, and then the mosquito then next time it bites an uninfected person will have that kind of pathogen in its salivary glands, and so it'll basically pass it on. That's the way we pass on kind of a protista infection. So they just think of malaria. Malaria and mosquitoes is a very common example, and that's what these look like. So they have chloroplast, nucleus, a flagellum, similar to make it nice and mobile. So they have lots of features of a plant cell in there, but you don't need to know massive detail about it, but just be aware of it. Fungal infections, so things like ringworm are common. So I mentioned ringworms, athlete's foot is a good example of that. Or another common one is what's it called? Tinea. It's a certain type of tinea, but it's the one you get on your toenails, so kind of fungal nail infection. That's common to see. So that's via touch. So common infection of human skin and nails. So you might get a rash, and like fungus is sporing from that, and that rash could become very contagious. And yeah, with fungi, again, they spread easily via touch and common materials and stuff. So sharing towels or sharing clothes. So just be aware of all that. And that's why it's just important to wash your hands regularly and wash your, just shower and make sure you're nice and clean a lot of the time, and using clean clothes, clean towels, all that kind of stuff. Because yeah, athlete's foot is a good example, and kind of fungal nail infections. So you might have seen people with kind of fungal nails, which very yellow discolor. That's often through fungi, which spread, and they can be treated through different forms of drugs. So a bit of a bacteria, virus, protista, fungi, as different ways of infection spreading. Quick question, just to test your knowledge. So which of these types of infections involves using host cells to replicate? So which one involves host cells? Just a little quickly test knowledge. See how well you've been listening. Give it last minute or so. Yeah, but I'll just move on for time. Good, majority you got that right. So it's viruses. So remember, viruses don't have the ability to replicate themselves. They have to attach to what we call host cells. So when viruses, they invade a host cell and they'll take over the machinery of that to replicate. So viruses are them, good. another question. So how is HIV transmitted? So which one of these? Oh, mostly got that right. Well done. So it's bodily fluids. So bodily fluids like blood, it's like sexual fluids. So unprotected sex is a common way, and all that kind of stuff. Good job. Just quick couple questions. Lovely, and that's infectious disease done. So we've been over all this stuff. So we've been over non-infectious diseases being caused by environmental factors and genetics, infectious diseases caused by other organisms such as pathogens. Having one type of disease can lead to having more, like in HIV. And we've been through all the different types of transmission: droplet, airborne, vectors, direct contacts, or common vehicles like insects. And then pathogens, we've been over them in a little bit of depth. So bacteria, viruses, protista, fungi, and also parasites. So yeah, I hope that's easier. I know it might not have been too in depth, but I don't want to overcomplicate it either. So we've got some past paper questions to do. I've been talking for a while though, so I want to give you guys a little break. So it's 10 to. If you come back in 5 minutes, we'll then carry on. So that's the first topic done of the day, and we'll just go over some past paper questions to consolidate it. So I think it's just con 10 to now. So if you come back just after 5 to, and then we'll continue with that. So yeah, just a quick 5-minute break, just get a drink, stretch your legs, all that. So I'll see you in 5 minutes. Hi again, guys. We'll restart again. So yeah, before the break, we've been over infectious disease, how they can be infectious and non-infectious. So different ways that we can communicate them and transmit them. And then we've looked at bacteria, viruses, fungi, protista, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, so hopefully it should make sense. It's not an overly tricky topic, and we'll go over some questions just to kind of show you how it presents in an exam style format. I think that's the best way. But we discussed bacteria, different types like TB and Salmonella, viruses, how they take over a host cell, and that's the way they kind of spread. And then we discussed about fungi as well, so they can be passed on through just again through transmission and sharing things, and then like protista, which are like malaria, for example, is a good example of that, how malaria can pass on the disease from one person to another. So good, should make sense. So let's do some questions just to restart our knowledge. So often we like to do that in these questions. The scientists have investigated the different factors on health. Parents, people who are not active may have health problems. The graph shows the percentage of 16-year-olds in some countries who are not active. So it shows a graph here. So graph questions always very common in exams. They love it. They love data questions. So always be aware of it. So what percentage of 16-year-olds in the UK are not active? So again, this is the percentage of 16-year-olds who are not active. It's saying on the graph, and then it shows you percentage for each country. So it's just about going on the graph and reading it. And if you read across, just go across here. I reckon it's 64, it says there. And so it's the answer to that. So that's quite a basic question, should just be able to read it. What percentage of 16-year-olds in the UK are active? So then if 64% are not active, then you would do 100 minus 64, which is 36. Newspaper headline states people in the UK are laziest in the world. Information in figure 1 does not support the newspaper headline. It suggests one reason why. So yeah, the first part was very straightforward. This is also just a 1-mark question. I also always look at, like I tell you guys, look at the word before what command it's telling you to do. So because it's saying suggest, it's just something basic you need to say. So if it suggests one reason why this might be wrong. So the headline is people in the UK are the laziest in the world. So why is that incorrect? So have a think, and then we'll go over. So you just need to state one reason why. It's quite a bold statement to say, isn't it? But you need to give a reason why that might be wrong. So what I'd be thinking is something like, it's saying obviously people in the UK are laziest in the world. This graph is only about 16-year-olds. It doesn't consider all the other age groups. So you can't necessarily say that all people in the UK are lazy because it's only about 16-year-olds. So you can say maybe only 16-year-olds, one age group. And another reason is the fact that you're only comparing 5 countries. Obviously, if you're comparing the world, there's nearly 200 countries in the world, but you're only comparing 5 countries here. So even though the UK is highest out of these 5 countries, doesn't mean it's the highest in the world. So only a small amount of countries or something along those lines. But you need to write one, and then you just need to state it like that, like small countries. So just be aware of those kind of questions. These questions you should be able to just kind of blitz through quite quickly. So yeah. Yep, 64, and then yeah, only 16-year-olds, or does not refer to all the ages, and only some countries. Lovely. Carry on. So doctors give a percentage rating to the health of 16-year-olds. 100% is perfect health. Table shows the amount of exercise 16-year-olds do and their health rating. What conclusion can be made about the effect of exercise on health? Use information from the table. I'll give you a minute for you guys to do that. With past paper questions, it's nice if you kind of go along with me. If you have a spare piece of paper in front of you and you can answer them, that often can be quite useful. what's the conclusion that could be made? So again, this is only 1 mark, so you just do like one basic sentence, but it's a conclusion. So you can see obviously this is the amount of exercise going up, and then the health rating you can see also goes up. So it's just kind of a trend that you're spotting here. So you need to write one sentence. So you could say something like more exercise, more amount of exercise gives a higher health rating. Or something like that. So more amount of exercise gives a higher health rating. Just making a conclusion from that. Or the higher the amount of exercise, the higher the health rating. Or the less exercise, the lower the health rating. Something like that. Just again, spotting basic trends. 1 mark question, nice easy sentence. Inherited factors can also affect health. Give one health problem that may be affected by the genes in someone inherits. So which one of these do you reckon can also affect your health? That may be affected by the genes someone inherits. Which one is going to be to do with genes out of all these? Give you a minute to think. So you just need to circle one of them. So it's talking about obviously exercise and health rating and all that. And so which one might be affected by the genes someone inherits, in particular to this kind of question? So being malnourished, not really. Malnourished is more an environmental kind of reason, often in poor countries or not having access to food. So it's not going to be that. Having a deficiency C disease, again, although it can be passed on, it's not passed on through genes, but it can be passed on from mother to child through like breast milk and other ways. But it's not passed on through genes generally. It's more through if you acquire it yourself through kind of bodily fluids. But a high cholesterol level can be passed on. So generally, some genes can predispose you to having more cholesterol. And so if you have a family history of people who have heart problems and have high cholesterol, all that, you could be predisposed to that. Doesn't mean you will get it, but you could have a higher risk of getting it. So the answer is high cholesterol level, which I'm sure most of you were thinking anyway. Yep, and there we go, that's the answers. So exactly what I've kind of written. These questions are quite basic though, so I wouldn't expect you to have any problems. Lovely, we'll continue. So